This is going to be an overview of deck building theory for Whitewoods. I don't want to spend too much time going over the super basic stuff, like the exact text of what the cards do. And I don't want to spend too much time going over the state of the current meta because this may have to be updated if we get a ban list soon. But just to recap briefly the situation that we're in right now, which matters for deck building anything. Fire is the best deck. They can play 18 hand traps, and they have excellent engine cards with functional redundancy, which means if you draw a bunch of your starters that are also extenders and you get hand trapped, you're basically just checking for hand traps to read what your opponent has rather than actually getting stopped. And most decks cannot do that. So you have to be able to play with engine cards that allow you to play through hand traps at a bare minimum. And then ideally, you should also be able to play through breakers, because if you look back at what makes decks good in the past, it's if you have interactions that are not all consolidated into one place. Like, you don't want to have all of your power in just the monster zone and then you lose to Dark Ruler, or all of your power in the spell and trap zone and then you lose to Lightning Storm or Feather Duster, or all your power in the graveyard or your hand or whatever. So if you can diversify the locations of your interactions, then your deck is generally more resilient. So I want to show you how you can build this deck to be generally resilient against a lot of things in the meta, while it still is actually functional and does not cripple the engine in any way. Firstly, just to give a super brief overview of what the cards do. You have two babies, Reset and Asteria, and these are the starters of the deck. These are also the cards that are extremely important for your resource cycle. The general game plan for this deck is that you make the level 6 synchros. This one is the Book of Eclipse effect on summon, and this is the one that searches either a Whitewoods card, so it searches engine, or a light spellcaster monster. This is going to be very important for, in my opinion, for how you should be playing this deck. And those cards can go into Diabel, Phoenix of the Whitewoods, which can bring you back any spell or trap in your graveyard if it was made using a tuner synchro, which basically means one of these and a baby. It also has a useful effect to send a spell or trap from your hand or field to the grave, like with all of the Whitewoods cards, and special summon a level 7 or lower tuner synchro monster from your extra deck, grave, or banishment. So the most typical use of this is on your opponent's turn, you can bring out Silvera, the Book of Eclipse. You can shuffle it back with one of these cards, and you can bring it out again with a trap. So generally, you're getting 2 Book of Eclipses on your opponent's turn. You can do it more than that, but I think that's excessive, and you should be diversifying the types of interactions you have, not just all focusing into one thing, which makes you have harder matchups if you overcompensate for one particular playstyle. The level 4s, this one is a strong extender because you can special summon it if you control a Whitewoods monster. And this card is kind of a starter, but it's not as good as the babies. If it is normal or special summoned, you can add a Whitewood spell or trap from your deck to your hand. So you could normal summon this, add Legend, and then Legend, if you control an illusion or spellcaster monster, you can add a Whitewoods monster from your deck. So even if you use your normal summon on this, you search this, you can get Asteria, and you can still go into your synchro plays from there. But the main thing, if you're new to this deck, that you should understand is this card is the one that can bring itself back during either your turn or your opponent's turn. So if a spell or trap is sent to your grave to activate a monster effect while this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon this card. I don't know why they made it so that with Reset, if a light spellcaster tuner is special summoned to your field during your opponent's turn only, while this card is in your graveyard, you can add it to your hand. So I don't know why they made that distinction here, but it's very important that you continue cycling through these so that you maintain card advantage. The other thing that's important for the very basic game plan is that these 2 cards can special summon themselves from the grave onto the field by shuffling back one of your Whitewoods synchro monsters, either from the field or from the grave. So generally, you prefer to shuffle them back from the grave because it's free, as opposed to just replacing a card on your field, and then their effects become negated. Now, one other important thing that I should mention here before I get into the choices for the deck building is that all of these cards, their effects that send a spell or trap to the grave to do something, are cost. This is very important because it means you can play cards like Skill Drain, even debatably in the main deck, because it is sent for cost. It's kind of like if you played Snake Eyes and you have Snake Eye Ash on the field and Skill Drain. Because Ash sends for cost, you can send your own Skill Drain to the grave, and Ash will resolve because it's no longer negated by Skill Drain. This is extremely strong because Skill Drain is a very good card. It's very good against Tempai. Well, it's very good against lots of decks. And so being able to play Skill Drain effectively is extremely useful. So you should always remember that. In fact, even when these cards are negated because they brought themselves back from the grave, you can still attempt to pay the cost for activating the effect. And even though the effect will resolve without effect because they're negated when they bring themselves back, you can still pay the cost and turn off your Skill Drain or whatever it is that you want to do, or send your Toy Soldier or your Toy Tank and trigger those effects. So that is the basic idea of the deck. You basically have an offensive Book of Eclipse type monster, and then you have our Ciela, which either searches you Engine, or the one card that everybody knows that it searches is Effect Veiler, because it searches a light spellcaster monster or Whitewood's card. So let's go into what you absolutely must play, and then I will show you other versions of this. I don't think that this is the best version of the deck right here, but you must play Toy. You must play Toy Box at 3 for sure. It is mandatory. In the OCG, for some reason, I have seen them play mostly 1 or 2 Soldier and then 1 Tank. This card does not need Toy Box to be good. This is an extremely useful card because it is a free card. If you send this card as cost to activate your Whitewood's effects, even if you don't have Toy Box, first of all, you can special summon this card. Then, if this card is normal or special summoned, you can add a Toy Box from your deck to your hand. Or if you control Toy Box, you can add a level 4 light monster instead, which is half of your engine. So you must play this card at 3, in my opinion. Tank, I think there's some debate for playing more of it, especially if you are on Power Spell and you want more engine in your deck. This is still a free send because it brings itself back, and it actually does have some very useful interactions because, okay, there we go. If it's sent, it brings itself back, but you contribute this monster, that's cost, special summon a level 6 or lower monster from your hand. Or if you control Toy Box, which is most of the time that you have access to this card, you can special summon a level 6 or lower monster from your graveyard instead. What's important about this is 2 things. First of all, it does not negate the effects. Second of all, you will often find yourself in a position in this deck where you need a different combination of levels on the field. Or you have too many non-tuners or too many tuners and you need the other. So this card basically can replace itself with what other Whitewood's monster you have in your graveyard you need to continue your combo. So it's not just that it's a free card, it actually has some application for modifying how your combo route goes. Okay, so now the basic stuff is over. I want to actually talk about the tech options and spend more time going over that. So Magician Souls is a package that you can play in this deck because it has synergy with the rest of the cards. It will proc your toy cards and therefore enable you to search your engine if you haven't drawn it or if you're looking for extenders. It also can interact with these cards because if it sends them, they will reset themselves for free and you get to draw 2 cards. So a version of the deck where you're playing Chicken Game, which you can recycle because after you've gotten the draw, you can send it for any of your monsters and then you can bring it back with Diabel. So if it's Synchro Summon with a Tuner, Synchro Monster's material, one of these, you can target Spell Trap and give it added to your hand. So you can use Chicken Game like normally twice per turn as long as you have access to it. So it's very easy to draw cards with this deck. It's actually, if you have access to Toy Box, so easy to make bodies that I was looking up different types of boss monsters that you could play. And you can make Metaphys Horus, or rather you can make a level 6 Synchro very easily. That's what the deck is supposed to do. And you will often have access to a tuner on the field after that. Sometimes you don't know what to do with the body. So I'm just showing here that as an option, you can make Sword Soul Sinister Sovereign as a boss monster behind your other standard plays. Another cheeky tech that you can play is Mythical Beast Garuda. This is a light spellcaster monster. So remember that this card, our Ciela, searches a light spellcaster monster or a Whitewood's card. And the reason that I show this card is because the pendulum effect is if you have no other card in your other pendulum zone, which you won't, you can target another spell or trap on the field, destroy both it and this card. So this is a way to out some spell or trap that you don't have another way to out through engine. I'm not saying that you should play this per se, but it could be a useful tech. The Beware the Whitewood's card, is very restrictive, and I don't think that you should main deck it. I'm actually not even sure if you should side deck it. I don't even think that people play this in the OCG from the list that I've seen. The restriction is weird because you have to control a level 6 or higher illusion or spellcaster monster. Then you can target a card your opponent controls and destroy it. Whereas with Legend of the Whitewood, you just have to control an illusion or spellcaster monster. So that could be any of your engine here. It could even be Magician's Souls. I don't know why this one doesn't have a level requirement and this one does, but it makes this substantially worse, even if you're going second. The other thing that is worth mentioning is that you do not need to play the Centurion cards to go into Blazar or Calamities. Now, if you do play the Centurion cards, then you will have a higher ceiling because you can very, very easily make Synchro 12, which would typically be Auxilia in that deck because that searches the Centurion cards. Crimson Dragon, go into Blazar, remake Crimson Dragon, and then in the draw phase, you can Calamities under the protection of Blazar or make a second Blazar. That's what OCG does. So you do not need the Centurion cards. They add additional bricks and an inefficient number of normal summons into your deck. Now, you can play the deck with Prosperity, and this is useful if you want to guarantee that you can access your Toy Box or Toy Soldier, which is what makes the deck good. The deck is 100% not good without these cards. You must play them. They cost cents in Terminal Revenge, so you should get these. Any hand where you don't open these is a substantially worse hand. So this is really the heart and soul of the deck is Toy Box and Toy Soldier. So Prosperity enables access to these cards, and it allows you to play cards like Skill Drain, which are so good that you can even get utility out of them going second. We saw some decks in the Italian Nationals main this card for that reason. Also because they can turn it off with their Snake Eyes cards, and so can we, because we send for cost. So this card is very good. It is better if you have Prosperity. But you can't play cards like Chicken Game or Magician's Souls. Now, the problem with this deck is that if you put all of your non-engine into power spell cards, you will, for example, auto-lose to decks like Pure Centurion, who are just going to Calamity Lock you the first thing that you do, and it's very hard to play around that. So right now, I think what is the best fit for the meta is a hand trap version of this deck that still has, some powerful plays that it can make. And I want to go over really this part of the deck because I think this is probably one of the better ways of playing it. The downside here is that your spell and trap count is lower, but since you always want to see the box and the soldier anyhow, it's not like, drawing an imperm or a skill drain so that you have something to send is going to be good. If you have to send an imperm or a skill drain just to play, you have a horrendous hand. Now, I have these 3 cards at the top of this list for a very specific reason, and I haven't seen anyone playing these searchable cards besides Veiler. So Veiler is the card that everyone knows that this searches because it's a light spellcaster, but this is also a light spellcaster, and it has 2 extremely important attributes in this deck. The first is, during the main phase, if a monster whose effects are negated is on the field, this is any combo that exists in your entire deck will always 100% of the time give you access to Arcia and Sylve in the graveyard. And when these cards bring themselves out, they are negated on the field. You will never, ever, ever, unless you cannot play, not be able to summon this card. Less importantly, if you have it and Veiler or Imperm in your hand, then obviously you can special summon it if you've resolved that card, but that we're not counting for that. The math on that is super low. What's important is that you can access this through Engine because you can search it and you can always enable it. Now, right now in this game, it is very, very common to special summon from the deck. So if your opponent special summons from the deck, you get to draw 2 cards. Drawing 2 cards is extremely useful if you are on any type of hand trap build. It is less useful if you're playing power spells. So if your hand trap count is less than 18, so you're not playing as much as Snake Eyes is. I mean, you could replace the skill drains with hand traps, but we'll get to that later. Drawing 2 cards is almost certainly, or rather, it is very likely to draw you into more hand traps. So this is useful. Or if they special summon from the extra deck, you can destroy one. So it generally will be useful no matter what matchup you're playing. The other important attribute is this is a level 8. That is very useful. Why? Because 8 and 4 gives you 12. And that means that you can go into Legathia, which, in my opinion, you should play even if you are not playing the Crimson Dragon package. The reason for that is you'll often find yourself in a scenario where you have a strange number of levels, or you could do something else, like some of the standard plays, but you would rather get a pop and a draw and something with large attack to attack over something else. This deck does not have large attack monsters, so if you can't Eclipse and then destroy the defense position monsters, sometimes you have trouble. So this card is, I would say, generally useful enough that it should just be in your extra deck as a generic access option. But if you're playing the Crimson Dragon package, then you probably want to play one Blazar on one Calamities. You could play two Blazars, but I have some other cards in here that I wanted to include. So yeah, this card I think is very useful because it is a combo piece. I showed this in my previous video about how to play through Nib by going into 4 Material Apple without using your normal summon. And this is useful for one of those combos that I show in there with Crimson Dragon going into Blazar. Now, here's the other thing. The toy box cards are not tuners, but they are level 4s. Oftentimes, whether or not you're interrupted, you will find that you have a number of level 4s on field, and you have to choose between making another Synchro 8, which I think that you should play a generic Synchro 8 in the deck because you don't just want to continue making this card over and over. And this is generic. So Draco Berserker of the Tenyi is a very good way to clear your tuner and non-tuner bodies if you don't have something better to make, which is very, very often, especially if they only hand trap you once or not at all. But there is another thing you can do, and that is you can make Gallant Granite. Now this card only requires 2 level 4 monsters. If you're new to the game, you may not remember what this does, but you can detach 1 material from this card and then add a rock monster from your deck to your hand. Nibiru is a rock monster. So what does this mean and why is this important? Why would you want to make this card and search Nibiru? So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that makes a deck good is diversifying the locations of its interactions. You don't want to lose the Dark Ruler because all you have is monsters on your field, or Feather Duster / Lightning Storm because all you have is spells or traps set. This card makes it so that you have the cards that you've played on field, so what your engine actually gets to. You have cards in your graveyard that will help you synchro summon with the trap that you have set here. So you have both back row, graveyard, and on-field interruptions, but you also want to have access to interruptions in your hand. So Gallant Granite is a way to turn 2 level 4s, whether there are tuners or not, into a hand interruption. And you may be thinking, if I'm going first, why would I want to search Nib and Nib my own field? The reason is, it doesn't matter. These cards going into the grave is fine. It makes special summoning the Sylve and the Arcea from the grave completely free. You should also understand that if you are not playing the resource cycle, where in your opponent's turn, you are special summoning Asteria and adding Rosette back to your hand, you are not playing this deck correctly. You should always have access to Rosette and Asteria in rotation during your opponent's turn, especially, and these cards in the grave. So when you nib yourself, after you've used your interactions on the field, you just cycle through your resources again. You can, for example, you can even save your trap until after you've nibbed if the gameplay works out that way. And then you can shuffle back whichever of these cards went to the grave with one of these. You can activate your trap, bring it to level 2, and you can sync into this again. So this card is extremely good in this deck. This deck does not suffer by nibbing itself at all. So these 2 cards, even if you're not playing hand traps, I think you should play these 2 cards because the extra deck space isn't actually that tight. So Nib and Valor are very useful. You could argue that Sword Soul is not useful because it requires some type of setup, but the setup is so trivial in this deck that I generally think that it's worth it. And if you're on a hand trap build, you should seriously consider how useful it is to draw 2 cards when your opponent special summons from deck. Okay, so now that that is mentioned, I should go over the link cards. First of all, you must play Little Knight. If you cannot afford the card, then you can't afford the card. But you can always turn bodies into Little Knight. One of the most common scenarios is that you will make Gallant Granite, and this body is then useful after you've searched the 1 nib, and you want to turn it into something else, and it just becomes the Little Knight. So you don't want to be wasting your bodies on the field that don't do anything. You always have access to this card. Appaloosa is a card that is generally more useful if you are uninterrupted, but they have nib. And so you make Appaloosa on the 5th summon if you have access to Box and like Rosette, for example. So this card gets a format Appaloosa, and so there's no reason not to play it. You may be thinking, why not play Celine if you have spellcasters in your entire deck? The problem with Celine is that many routes in this deck do not lead to you having enough spells on field and engrave, and it doesn't come up nearly enough for me to think that it's worth it. I think that there are some flex spots in the deck. Baguska, for example, is like a last ditch card that is generically useful against some decks. Like if you got hand trapped against Flu or some strange deck and you just need a level 4 to sit on, or if you don't know what your opponent is playing and you get hand trapped and you want to sit on something. The other card that I thought was interesting is Rafflesia. The reason for that is many hands, especially if you're interrupted multiple times, you can't make Appaloosa before Nib. And so if you are siding and you think that they're playing Nib, you can just play Rafflesia instead and side in the Gravedigger's Trap Hole. So yeah, you can negate Nib and then they take 2,000 damage, which could also be relevant to time. I included this here as an honorable mention, which is better if you're not playing Skill Drain and Imperm in the grave, but you still can play this card. Time Space Trap Hole is generally one of the higher impact ones, and if you're playing against something like Branded, where you don't want to have to deal with a Mare Jade End Phase effect, which doesn't kill this deck because you're okay with your resources being in the grave as long as you can cycle through them. But still, not having to deal with Mare Jade's effect because you're returning it to the extra deck so it can't trigger is useful, or against like other types of cards. I also should show you that this card is easy to make because it's a tuner and a light monster, which is like your entire deck. And so this card searches Vanadium Reframing, and that stops you losing to stuff like Droplets and Dark Ruler, which, if you're playing the way that I suggest with these hand traps, you won't lose to those things anyhow. But I think this card is useful because this is a level 8 tuner, which means that you can go into Synchro 12 plays if you want. But you also have a counter trap. And I think especially if you're playing in like a locals or a larger event where you don't know what people are going to be playing and you think there may be some high impact cards or some power spells or whatever, this could be a useful card to play, but you don't need to main this. Do not main this card. I've seen a lot of people maining this is completely a brick going second. Another honorable mention here is Jowgen. Remember this card, it adds a White card or a light spellcaster monster from your deck to your hand. So Jowgen is a light spellcaster monster. Now, here's the thing, okay? If you're new to the game, you can discard a random card from your hand to the graveyard, destroy all special summon monsters on the field. More importantly, this is the setup for if you're going first, neither player can special summon monsters. So, Jowgen is similar to Baguska in the sense that they have to out this, first of all, to be able to play. And if they do out it, then you want to have access to your stuff in the grave and your trap so that you have follow-up plays. It's not like you're going all in on one thing. But this card is a floodgate that is searchable. So I think it's worth consideration for the side deck, but I think maining it is just asking to draw a dead card if you're going second. Other cards to think about are high-impact normal traps like Debarrier and Daruma, and that is mostly if you're playing Thrust. Or Prosperity, or both of those cards. Same with Change of Heart, except for going second. Evenly Matched is another card that I think is like fine to play in this deck, but it's not as good if you're on hand traps because you don't want to have to use like 2 hand traps and then you draw Evenly Matched, and now you're playing with almost no engine in hand. So those are some general like ideas for the side deck, but I think that you should seriously consider that Gallant Granite and possibly even Rafflesia are staples for if you go first in the main deck, then you can search Nib, or if you're going second, or if you're going first after siding, you have options for things to side in that make it easier to play around Nib because you can play this as a combo deck. Other things to consider. Tri-Edge Master is not amazing, but I think that you maybe have to play this card because it is a level 6, so it's very easy to make with your standard cards, the level 4 tuner and the level 2 non-tuner. And sometimes you kind of need another card to play, and just going into one Synchro 6 isn't going to do anything, or you would like to go into Arciela, but you don't have the spell or trap to send to activate the effect, so you can't continue your play, and so you need a draw. But what makes this card playable, because that's a horrible reason on its own to play it, is it's a level 6 light. That means that Chaos Angel is even more accessible. So you can already make Chaos Angel pretty easily on this deck, but oftentimes, especially if you have a lot of excess bodies, you want to be gaining advantage when you climb. So you're drawing a card off of Tri-Edge, you go into Chaos Angel, and you get to banish a card, and then your synchro monsters are protected. You can also consider that this is like in a strange way a way to play around Nibiru because you could make Tri-Edge Master early and go into Chaos Angel going first, even when they have no monsters on field, and then climb into Diabel and not worry about Nib. Obviously, if you can go the Appaloosa route, that's better, but that's something to take into consideration. So that is my general overview of Whitewoods. I think that it is debatable whether you should play power spells or hand traps, but I think the hand traps work very well with Iris Sword Soul that is also a combo piece. I think the Valor and Nibiru being searchable by engine makes them at least one-ofs regardless of the deck that you're playing. I think the Toy Box and Toy Soldier are the heart and soul of this deck in terms of the resource economy, and so you must play them at 3. You can consider playing more tanks if you are on power spells, because you simply need too many spaces for hand traps otherwise. You can replace the skill drains with more hand traps, like Ghost Ogres, or more Nibirus, based on like what your meta is, so that you have a more favorable number of hand traps. But like I said, this card has good interactions with the deck because you can turn it off whenever you want. And worst case scenario is a trap so that you can send it. So let me know if you have any other questions. I maybe will briefly mention that Power Spell, as we've seen in like Italian mats, is somewhat compatible with cash cards. And these cards do make you play through hand traps a little better because your opponent has to think twice with Unicorn and so on. But it does add incompatibilities into the deck where like you don't want to play or search Nib, but also be playing cash cards, and you don't want to draw Birth, you want to search it. But then it's good to draw Planet because Planet is a free send. So there are trade-offs with this, but you're basically forced out of hand traps and into Power Spell because this increases your engine size too much. Also, last thing I will mention, this card, when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can send a spell or trap from your hand or field to the grave, special summon a level 7 or lower tuner synchro monster from your deck, extra deck, or banishment. You do not have to summon the Whitewoods cards. One thing that I noticed this deck can't do that is a problem is if your opponent, for example, activates like a Tempai field spell and you don't have a way to clear it, and so you can't Book of Moon their monsters or anything, that can be difficult to play around because they can set up their entire field, maybe go into Transcendent Dragon, then you can't respond in the battle phase, you can never book them or whatever. But if you summon TG Wonder Magician, now this will not get its pop when it is summoned, okay? Because it has to be synchro summoned, and this does not count as a synchro summon, it's just a special summon. So this will not get the effect. However, quick effect, immediately after this effect resolves, synchro summon using this card you control. This is a level 5 tuner. So 5 and 2, 5 is 6, 7, can go into Kui Belt. And Kui Belt, when it is synchro summoned, you can target a card on the field, destroy it. So this generic spot removal is something that the deck does not have and it struggles with. But having 2 extra deck slots dedicated to this, I think, is maybe not worth it if it stops you from playing cards like Appaloosa or the Gallant Granite, which I think is actually very, very useful. I think you could argue that Rafflesia is not worth it if you need more side deck space, so I'm just suggesting that as a tech option, but it's worth noting that if this is not something you have in your toolbox, you could consider playing Wonder Magician to bring out the Kui Belt, but it's not like super efficient.